If you follow the news at all, you know that the security environment in the Indo-Pacific is, well, it's the subject of some really intense focus right now, maybe more than at any time since the Cold War, really. We hear constantly about a potential Taiwan contingency, a lot of escalating rhetoric, and this accelerated military modernization happening across the board. It feels urgent, volatile.
And deeply precarious. That's the word for it.
Right. So when people talk about a major conflict, specifically an invasion scenario, the conversation almost always lands on two things. It's either Taiwan's own defenses, or it's the big, obvious U.S. naval assets.
Yeah.
The aircraft carriers, the battleships.
The carrier strike groups.
Exactly. But the central strategic question, the one that really defines whether an intervention would succeed or fail, it's actually much more foundational. It's simpler. What critical military infrastructure fails first, and how quickly?
And that is exactly where the cold, hard, quantitative analysis comes in. It just pulls us right away from those tactical naval debates. We're moving the conversation straight to the concrete foundations of deterrence. The core material we've synthesized for you today, and this comes specifically from an analysis from a major U.S. defense think tank, CSIS, following their massive January 2023 war game. It paints a picture that is, well, not only terrifying, but it exposes a huge strategic oversight.
An asymmetry.
A massive one. This deep dive is focused squarely on what our sources are calling the greatest strategic asymmetry in the region, the terrifying systematic vulnerability of the forward U.S. and allied air bases. Look, if you want a shortcut into the most important military problem facing U.S. defense planners today, this is it.
Absolutely. Our mission today is to take that shortcut. We're jumping past the naval parades and getting right into the weeds of theater-level operations. We're going to look at the quantitative analysis of this potential 2026 conflict scenario. We're going to unpack the devastating specifics of what that war would look like, what the almost unthinkable price of winning would be.
And that's a key point, the price of winning.
And how a systematic, decade-long investment by China in hardened infrastructure stands in just stark, destabilizing contrast to the exposure of U.S. and allied bases. We're talking places like Japan, the Philippines, and even, shockingly, the U.S. mainland.
It's absolutely critical for you to understand that this isn't just a localized problem about Taiwan's defense. This vulnerability, it defines the viability of the entire regional security architecture. We're talking South Korea, the United States, Japan. The consensus coming out of this quantitative wargaming is that any success for the defenders, and we have to stress it is a very costly Pyrrhic success, it hinges entirely on robust institutionalized alliance cooperation and, most critically, survivable infrastructure.
So if the forward bases, the staging grounds for air power, if they collapse in the opening hours,
then the entire U.S. defense strategy collapses with them. It doesn't matter where the carriers are at that point.
Okay, so let's start with the geopolitical shift, because that really provides the immediate context for all this crisis planning. We've seen key U.S. allies in the region explicitly align their strategies with Washington's deepening concerns about China's aggression and its capabilities.
That alignment is probably the most important foundational shift in regional politics that we've seen in a long time. Take South Korea, for example. In December 2022, the Yoon administration announced its Indo-Pacific strategy for freedom, peace, and prosperity.
Which is not just a catchy title, I assume.
Not at all. It's a powerful statement. The strategy emphasizes shared values, liberal democracy, rule of law, human rights, and it aligns explicitly with the Biden administration's broader Indo-Pacific strategy. But what it means in practical terms is a real commitment to strengthening these core value alliances, particularly that trilateral cooperation between the Republic of Korea, the U.S., and Japan.
Which have been tricky in the past.
Very tricky. But this is happening precisely because of the intensified great power competition. It moves RRK policy away from a focus solely on the peninsula and toward a broader regional role, especially when it comes to freedom of navigation and maritime security, which, directly intersects with any potential Taiwan contingency planning.
So you have this tightening of the alliance structure. It's driven by this shared concern, and that naturally leads us to the question of timing. Why are defense analysts focusing so acutely on the year 2026 for this invasion scenario? It sounds uncomfortably precise, almost like a ticking clock.
It's precise because it's based on a really sober analysis of military modernization cycles and that technological gap. The CSIS study determined that 2026 represents the narrowest point, the peak of danger, if you will, in the military power gap between the U.S. and China.
The narrowest point. What does that mean exactly?
Okay, so to understand why, you have to look at the U.S. investment schedule. The U.S. Military Modernization Program, which is aimed at shifting resources and developing new survivable capabilities for a high-end conflict. Well, that began in earnest around 2019.
Right.
And it's projected to be completed closer to 2030. So in 2026, the U.S. military is partially modernized, but it's not fully ready. But crucially, China's offensive capabilities, we're talking its long-range missile inventory, its amphibious lift capacity, its whole A2AD network, all of that will be sufficiently mature and numerous to present the most credible threat they have ever been able to mount.
So the U.S. is kind of halfway through a refit, and China is at the peak of its offensive readiness,
Yeah.
window of opportunity.
A window of maximum danger. And you mentioned there's a corresponding political clock ticking right alongside that military one, which makes 2026 even more potent.
Ah, okay.
Exactly. This timing is linked directly to China's domestic politics and President Xi Jinping's tenure. He's potentially seeking a fourth consecutive term in 2027. So analysts are suggesting that he might see 2026 as the last best opportunity to achieve the unification objective, which is key to his political legacy, before the U.S. closes that technological gap completely and before the next major political cycle change.
So it's a now or never kind of calculation.
It could be. The source material contains a really dramatic insight here. The belief in Beijing might be that if China misses this window of opportunity, they may have to wait another 50 or even 100 years to achieve unification without facing the possibility of, catastrophic failure. The window is closing, and 2026 is seen as the apex of the military and political opportunity for the PLA.
That really makes the urgency palpable. And this military divergence that created this precarious window, it's just stark when you look at the long-term spending trends. We've seen visualizations that illustrate this incredible shift where the U.S. started decreasing its high-tech military focus while China was systematically doing the exact opposite.
That divergence is a defining feature of post-Cold War history. I mean, China's defense spending has shown this steep, continuous rise starting from the 1990s, and it's all been fueled by massive, relentless economic growth. They have been operating under a unified national purpose when it comes to military modernization for 3 decades now.
And the U.S.
Meanwhile, the U.S., having established itself as the sole superpower after 91, it faced all this domestic pressure to reduce defense spending. Particularly after the 2008 financial crisis, U.S. defense spending as a percentage of GDP just declined. The focus shifted heavily toward counterterrorism, policing rogue states.
The so-called wars of choice.
Exactly. And that led to a long period where investment in high-end, major power competition capabilities, things like anti-ship missiles or survivable air bases, was systematically neglected, or at least de-emphasized.
And this strategic oversight, this historical miscalculation about who the U.S. would be fighting next, it became brutally and immediately apparent in 1996. The Taiwan Strait crisis.
That moment, 1996, it defined China's entire military trajectory. When the then Taiwanese president visited the U.S., China retaliated. They fired ballistic missiles into the waters near Taiwan, just demonstrating their displeasure.
But the provocation stopped.
It stopped instantly. The U.S. dispatched the 7th Fleet aircraft carrier groups to the area, and China backed down because they simply lacked the capacity to challenge the U.S. Navy's conventional dominance.
Wow.
The humiliation of having their military action constrained by U.S. naval power, that led directly to massive, sustained, and highly focused investment by the PLA. China prioritized anti-ship, anti-aircraft, and anti-submarine capabilities. This is the origin of what we now universally call A2AD, or anti-access area denial.
Okay, let's slow down and really explain A2AD for the listener. It gets thrown around constantly, but what does it actually do in practice? And why is it the foundation of this whole 2026 threat assessment?
Right, so A2AD is essentially a military strategy, and it's designed to prevent U.S. forces from operating effectively close to China's coastline, and specifically close to Taiwan. It functions by employing a layered defense using highly accurate, long-range missiles and sensors.
So we're talking about things like the famous carrier-killer missile.
Exactly. Systems like the DF-21D, the Carrier Killer, and the DF-26, which is an intermediate-range ballistic missile. It's capable of targeting ships at sea and also fixed bases on land. It can potentially reach as far as Guam. The goal isn't just to challenge U.S. control, it's to make it so costly and so risky to operate within, say, 1,000 miles of the mainland that the U.S. is effectively denied access to the theater. They were determined to never have the U.S. 7th Fleet force them to back down again. A2AD is China's insurance policy against intervention, and its sheer quantity and reach are why 2026 is deemed the danger point.
That A2AD buildup provides the context. Okay, now, Let's get into the specifics of the CSIS wargame itself. When we say wargame, we need to be clear. This was not a simple board game scenario.
Right.
This was a highly sophisticated simulation. How is this methodology different from previous studies, and why are the results so widely cited?
Well, this was a landmark study because it didn't focus on small, tactical unit skirmishes. It expanded the scope to theater operations.
Theater operations, so that means...
It means strategic and operational levels. We're talking large-scale deployments of forces, logistics strikes across the entire regional map, incorporating all the allies, and critically, they used quantitative analysis, meaning they weren't just guessing outcomes. They ran 24 separate simulations, varying the assumptions, and they generated detailed battle damage assessments, or BDA, on naval, ground, and air forces. They tested basic, optimistic, and pessimistic scenarios for how resilient the defenders would be. The whole goal was to provide concrete, data-driven insight into the realistic trends of war-related losses.
And the key finding, the one that's been repeated across defense circles, it's a complex one. China would have failed to achieve its primary strategic objective, but the defenders would ultimately secure a victory best described as Pyrrhic.
Precisely. The wargame predicted that China would fail to force Taiwan's surrender within the simulated conflict timeline, which was generally set at a maximum of 21 days. After that, their amphibious lift capability or their logistics would fail, so the invasion would stall, the beachhead would be contained, and China would either withdraw or be destroyed.
Right.
But the victory for the U.S., Japan, and Taiwan would come at a catastrophic, unprecedented cost to all parties involved.
Let's talk about that cost, because the BDA numbers, the battle damage assessment numbers under the base scenario, they are truly shocking. And they directly inform why our bases are the core vulnerability here.
Under the base scenario, the cost in material is just immense. The United States loses 17 ships, which crucially includes 2 aircraft carriers. Two, and 270 combat aircraft, with 206 of those being U.S. Air Force assets. Japan takes a staggering hit with 26 battleships and 112 combat aircraft lost. China, for its part, loses the most ships, a massive 138 battleships, mostly due to intense early U.S. Air Force strikes, and 155 combat aircraft.
Okay, now look at that breakdown of aircraft losses again. The U.S. and Japan combined lost 382 jets. China lost 155. That's a staggering disparity for the side that supposedly won. Why the overwhelming aircraft losses for the defenders?
That right there is the most critical takeaway for our discussion today, and it tells the whole story of the strategic asymmetry. The U.S. and Japan suffered overwhelmingly higher jet losses primarily due to China's powerful A2AD capabilities, and specifically surprise missile saturation attacks on forward bases, especially in Japan, like Okinawa.
So they're hitting the planes on the ground.
Exactly. While the U.S. was successfully destroying many Chinese ships at sea, a significant portion of the U.S. and Japanese air forces were destroyed on the ground before they could even launch or return to safety. And we should note that in the simulation, the U.S. did not attack Chinese aircraft on mainland China bases, which certainly skews the results.
Right.
But even so, the vulnerability of the forward bases meant that the U.S. lost its primary offensive striking tool, its Air Force, before it could even establish sustained air superiority.
Let's focus on China's strategy here. We know their imperatives. Execute a rapid landing. They're projecting 22,000 to 43,000 PLA troops, block U.S. reinforcement, contain the waters. But why is the immediate missile attack on Japan so central to their plan?
Because Japan is the indispensable, non-negotiable strategic supply and basing hub for the U.S. The U.S. Air Force stationed in Okinawa, particularly at Kadena Air Base, is the force that would play the decisive role in destroying China's maritime and landing forces during that critical 48 to 72-hour window following the initial attack.
So if those jets can fly, the invasion fails.
If those U.S. jets can maintain a high sortie rate, China's amphibious operations fail, period. Therefore, China's primary goal in the opening moves of the conflict is a massive missile saturation attack on Okinawa and other key bases. They want to suppress the U.S. Air Force's sortie rate and destroy its jets on the ground. They are aiming for deterrence by destruction, making the cost of U.S. intervention immediately unacceptable to Washington.
And this brings us to a fundamental and I think highly debated premise of the CSIS simulation. The U.S. commitment to restraint. The U.S. chose not to attack the Chinese mainland. What was the rationale for imposing that constraint on U.S. forces, even while suffering catastrophic damage like losing 2 aircraft carriers?
That restraint premise is fundamental to the entire outcome, and it reflects the deep underlying fear of nuclear escalation. The central strategic decision in the simulation was to avoid escalation into an all-out war or, worst of all, a nuclear conflict. The U.S. kept the theater confined strictly to Taiwan's territorial waters and land.
But let me just push back on that as an interested observer here. If the U.S. loses 2 multi-billion-dollar carriers, which translates to thousands of casualties and the effective crippling of its Pacific fleet, is it truly realistic to assume U.S. political leadership would maintain that restraint? I mean, isn't that restraint premise the weakest, most controversial link in the entire simulation?
That is the perfect question, and many analysts agree it is the most unstable variable. The rationale for maintaining restraint, even under a devastating attack, is the scale of the potential Chinese response. Striking naval facilities and E-280 bases on the mainland risks triggering a massive existential mobilization by China. The PLA can potentially mobilize up to 2 million troops in wartime.
2 million.
2 million. And since the U.S. military is designed to be a high-tech expeditionary force, it is just not equipped to fight 2 million mobilized troops in a conventional ground war on the Asian continent. If the conflict escalates to that scale, the only effective weapon system the U.S. could use to respond effectively to that level of manpower is nuclear weapons. Therefore, the U.S. wants to avoid the nuclear option entirely, making restraint on the mainland, the agreement not to strike launch sites or staging areas, a key, though painful and arguably unrealistic, premise of the simulation.
Fascinating. So for the U.S. and its allies to achieve even that Pyrrhic victory, for China to fail in its invasion objectives, despite the U.S. not striking the mainland, 4 critical premises must be met. What are those conditions?
The CSIS study distilled it down to 4 non-negotiable requirements. First and foremost, the Taiwanese people's will to fight. Taiwan must fiercely resist.
Like Ukraine.
Exactly. The conflict timeline, 14 to 21 days, is only plausible if Taiwan puts up a fierce resistance, similar to the determination we saw in Ukraine in 2022. They have to prevent a quick collapse and bleed the initial landing forces dry. Second, the U.S. must commit immediately. A Ukraine-style response, just supplying weapons while staying non-belligerent, is not viable because of geography.
It's an island.
It's an island. China can impose a naval and air blockade instantly, cutting off all supply routes. Delayed U.S. military intervention, and we're talking measured in weeks, not days, means China wins, and wins rapidly. Third, triangle security cooperation is essential, specifically stable bases. The U.S. Navy and Air Force must secure stable, survivable, forward bases for sustainable, high-volume operations. We keep coming back to this. Kadena in Japan is the most significant. If U.S. bases in Japan are irreparably damaged and cannot recover quickly, the war cannot be won. The Air Force will be suppressed.
And the fourth condition.
The fourth condition. The Chinese fleet must be subdued early. This means the U.S. must rely heavily on long-distance air-to-ship missiles that can strike outside the Chinese mainland defense zone. The war game showed that China's A2AD power appears stronger than many estimated overwhelming, even powerful Aegis missile defense capabilities in some instances. The reliance on long-distance precise strike assets is absolutely forced by the restraint premise, since the U.S. cannot destroy the missile launchers on the mainland itself.
That third premise, the absolute need for sustained operations from stable, survivable bases, that is the linchpin of the whole defense strategy. If you don't meet that, everything else just collapses. And this is where our deep dive into concrete skies truly begins, examining this shocking asymmetry in preparedness between the aggressor and the defenders.
The contrast is truly the core destabilizing factor. On one side, we have China engaging in a decade-long, nationwide, systematic campaign to improve airbase resilience. On the other, we have a largely stagnant, often dismissive approach from the U.S. and its allies to passive defense, which reflects that post-Cold War hubris we talked about earlier.
Let's put some staggering numbers on China's hardening campaign. This wasn't a minor project. This is a national strategic effort. How comprehensive has this been since, say, the early 2010s?
The scale is almost incomprehensible in American defense terms. Since the early 2010s, China has more than doubled its number of hardened aircraft shelters, or HAS, increasing them from about 370 to over 800. And these are fixed, robust structures designed to withstand significant direct hits. If you count all shelters, both the hardened HAS and the less robust, non-hardened individual aircraft shelters, IAS, China now boasts over 3,100 total shelters.
3,000.
That's enough to house the vast majority of its combat aircraft, protecting them from 2 key threats: submunitions, which are basically cluster bombs, and near misses from larger munitions.
So if a missile hits the airbase, the aircraft is safe inside the shelter. which means China can sustain its operations even while under attack.
Correct.
But you noted it's not just shelters. They built redundancy into the entire infrastructure.
That's right. Air bases need more than just shelters. They need ways to recover and launch immediately. So China has expanded aggressively. They've added 20 full-length runways and, critically, over 40 runway-length taxiways that are explicitly designed to serve as auxiliary runways if the main one is hit. They've also increased their total ramp area nationwide by almost 75%.
That sheer scale is hard to visualize.
And analysts put it perfectly into a relatable analogy. The amount of concrete used by China just to improve the resilience of its airbase network could pave a 4-lane interstate highway.
A highway from where to where?
All the way from Washington, D.C. to Chicago.
Wow. Okay,
Yeah.
that demonstrates the level of strategic commitment they placed on base survivability.
It does.
And what's the strategic concentration of this effort near the Taiwan Strait?
They now have 134 air bases within 1,000 nautical miles of the Taiwan Strait, boasting more than 650 HSs. Furthermore, they've established modern organic airfield reconstitution units, supplemented by civilian contractors who are trained and equipped to repair runway and taxiway damage and sustain operations even under repeated attack. Their entire system is built for resilience.
Now, we pivot to the U.S. and allied side. We've had decades of strategic talk about maintaining forward posture. But what have the actual construction numbers been, say, since the U.S. started acknowledging the China threat in the 2010s?
This is where the asymmetry becomes shocking. If we look at U.S., allied, and partner airfields within that critical 1,000 nautical mile range of the Taiwan Strait, outside of South Korea, since the early 2010s, the U.S. military has added only 2 new hardened aircraft shelters.
2?
2.
That can't be right.
It is. There has been a small increase in non-hardened IASs, 1 new runway, 1 new taxiway, and a modest 17% increase in ramp area. Compare 2 new HAAS versus the hundreds constructed by China, the investment has been negligible compared to the threat.
This brings us to the core imbalance metric, which is probably the most terrifying figure in the source material. If we combine the total military airfield capacity of the U.S., its allies and partners, Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, are within 1,000 nautical miles of Taiwan, how does it compare to the PRC's?
The combined capacity is roughly 1/3 of the PRC's total capacity.
Okay, 1/3 is bad.
But it gets worse. If you start peeling back the layers based on strategic probability, say, you exclude the ROK, which may be pinned down by North Korean action, and the Philippines, where political access and hosting agreements are always complex, the capacity of the remaining defenders drops precipitously to just 15% of China's.
15%. That is a truly frightening number for sustaining a conflict.
It is. It means the PLA needs far fewer munitions, fewer shots, to neutralize the entire forward defense architecture. They can overwhelm the remaining capacity extremely quickly. This asymmetry isn't just a strategic disadvantage. It's a massive, destabilizing factor that risks inviting aggression. It gives China an almost irresistible incentive to exercise a first-mover advantage and launch a suppression campaign against exposed air power.
And we can see this vulnerability translated into specific real-world consequences when looking at specific bases, even outside the immediate theater. The analysis highlights that a surprisingly small number of missiles can neutralize facilities that are absolutely vital to U.S. global strategy.
Consider this: Marine Corps Air Station Iwakuni. It's the most important Marine Corps aviation facility in Japan, home to the crucial carrier Air Wing 5.
Okay.
Or Naval Support Facility Diego Garcia, the single most important U.S. facility in the entire Indian Ocean, critical for Middle East and Africa operations. Both of these massive critical bases could be neutralized with as few as 10 submunition-armed missiles.
10 missiles to knock out $1 billion base. Why so few?
Because they are exposed. The aircraft and the fuel stores are just sitting out on the ramp space waiting. A submunition missile releases hundreds of small bomblets that destroy anything not protected by a concrete roof.
So hardening changes the whole equation.
It changes the required munition type. If the aircraft are unprotected, you can use cheaper, high-volume submunitions. If they are hardened, China is forced to switch to more expensive, lower-volume unitary warheads designed to penetrate reinforced concrete.
And this vulnerability isn't just confined to the Indo-Pacific. It extends right to the U.S. mainland, which often thinks of itself as having sanctuary.
It does. Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, home to over 1/3 of the U.S. Air Force's F-22 fleet and crucial for national capital region defense, is similarly vulnerable. The source analysis confirms that just 10 submunition-armed missiles could destroy aircraft and fuel stores there.
And this isn't just a theory anymore.
Not at all. This threat is not theoretical. We've seen recent, well-documented instances of likely foreign drone swarms flying over Langley and other key installations. Whether that's surveillance or signaling, it's a reminder that America's homeland bases are no longer sanctuaries. They are targets for any major peer competitor seeking to cripple U.S. air power before it can even deploy.
The analysts made a powerful, quantitative case for the cost-effectiveness of hardening, using a base in the Philippines as a perfect example of defensive return on investment.
That example drives the point home perfectly. Look at Cesar Besa Air Base in the Philippines. It's one of the important EDCA sites, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement sites, that we rely on. Because it currently lacks hardening, 6 submunition missiles could neutralize aircraft and fuel, destroying millions of dollars in material.
6 missiles.
But if the U.S. were to invest relatively modest sums in hardening that base, China would immediately be forced to use 22 more expensive, less numerous unitary warhead missiles instead of cheap, high-volume submunitions. That significantly increases the opportunity cost for the PLA. It requires more launch assets, more planning, and it reduces the total number of critical targets China can hit across the entire theater. Hardening forces the enemy to spend more and hit less.
Which leads directly to the costly, historic misjudgment that created this vulnerability in the first place. Why did the U.S. start building these hardened shelters after the Cold War?
It was a strategic consensus that formed in the wake of the 1991 Gulf War. There was a perception that fixed hardened aircraft shelters were obsolete. During Operation Desert Storm, Allied forces destroyed 63% of Iraq's HACE using large penetrating bombs, and that led to this widely shared and incorrect institutional belief that hardened aircraft shelters aren't. The perception just took hold that fixed defenses couldn't survive the new era of precision strike.
But the analysis reveals that conclusion was dangerously flawed, wasn't it?
Highly flawed. I mean, despite achieving almost total air superiority and conducting 5 weeks of bombing, the U.S. and its allies failed to destroy 37% of the Iraqi HACE. And crucially, the HACE successfully protected against the vast majority of submunitions and near misses. The hardening forced the attacker, the U.S., to use those larger, more costly penetrating weapons. Hardening wasn't obsolete. The U.S. simply didn't update its own comprehensive plan to defend fixed sites against this new generation of threat. They misdiagnosed the effectiveness of the defense based on their own offensive success.
And this misjudgment is now being systematically repeated, even with the newest, most expensive generation of strategic assets being developed. This is the part that truly exposes the strategic negligence.
This example, perhaps more than any other, illustrates a profound misunderstanding of survivability. The U.S. Air Force plans to forego building approximately $30 million HACE for the new B-21 bombers.
B-21, the new stealth bomber.
The over $600 million strategic assets that form the backbone of U.S. future global strike capability. Instead of hardened shelters, the Air Force is opting for unhardened environmental protection shelters, basically hangars.
Wait, hold on. You are spending $600 million on a state-of-the-art bomber and refusing to spend 5% of that to ensure it survives the initial attack.
Exactly. It's purchasing the asset without purchasing the insurance. It leaves these high-value assets completely exposed, jeopardizing the entire U.S. global strike capability right at home.
That's stunning.
An analyst synthesized this absurdity perfectly by comparing the cost. A $4 million fighter HAS, which lasts for decades, costs the same as a single Patriot missile, or just 120th the cost of the $80 million fighter jet it is meant to protect. If we were running a business, we would consider it negligent to spend $80 million on a product and then refuse to spend $4 million to ensure its survival the first week. Yet, strategically, that is precisely the trade-off we are currently making. It is a profoundly unwise expenditure of resources.
And this vulnerability isn't happening in a vacuum. We need to broaden the scope again because analysts are deeply concerned that China would seek to force the U.S. into a devastating two-front conflict, primarily by leveraging North Korea.
That two-front scenario is the ultimate nightmare for Washington and its allies. The fear is that China could induce North Korea to launch localized provocations simultaneous with the Taiwan invasion. This forces the U.S. to divert critical resources.
Resources that are needed for Taiwan.
Exactly. Remember, the CSIS war game assumed that roughly 50% of the U.S. Air Force stationed in South Korea, the USFK, would be committed to Taiwan operations to help achieve those 4 premises required for victory. But if North Korea launches a localized attack or a serious provocation against the South, that USFK commitment would likely be pinned down entirely. The U.S. would be trapped dealing with two highly volatile situations, potentially involving two nuclear powers, as the Nuclear Posture Review 2022 explicitly forewarned.
And North Korea's capability to act as a destabilizing partner for China is rapidly increasing, both qualitatively in its missile tech and politically in its strategic posture.
On the technical side, North Korea is moving very, very quickly. We're seeing qualitative improvements in their missile capabilities. They are developing hypersonic glide vehicles, or HGVs, designed to break through ballistic missile defense systems. They are fielding longer-range ICBMs like the Hwasong-17 and Nagas-18, many of which now utilize solid fuel.
And solid fuel is significant because
solid fuel vastly improves concealment and the immediacy of a launch. Liquid-fueled missiles, they have to be fueled laboriously before launch, which gives away strategic warning. Solid-fueled missiles can be stored ready to fire in a hidden location, dramatically reducing the time the U.S. and its allies have to detect and react.
So less working time.
Much less. And on top of that, their operational readiness is growing, demonstrated by multiple simultaneous and continuous missile launches. They are practicing saturation strikes.
And on the political front, Kim Jong-un's recent policy shift regarding South Korea is truly chilling in the context of a potential two-front war.
It fundamentally changes the risk calculation for the peninsula and for the region. Kim Jong-un has changed North Korea's policy towards South Korea, designating the ROK as the principal enemy. He's effectively giving up entirely on the long-term goal of unification. This implies a significant move away from peaceful coexistence or even strategic tolerance.
So the rhetoric is much more hostile now.
And it dramatically increases the risk of nuclear use in a Korean peninsula contingency, especially given North Korea's focus on building up its tactical nuclear capabilities, which are designed for battlefield use rather than strategic deterrence against the U.S. homeland. They have lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons against the South.
How does North Korea leverage this threat specifically against Japan during a Taiwan crisis, since Japan is the indispensable hub for U.S. logistical support?
North Korea's goal would be strategic decoupling. They aim to prevent Japanese logistical and military support to the U.S. military from those critical forward bases like Kadena. They would likely use nuclear threats, or what we call nuclear blackmail, against Japan.
Nuclear blackmail.
Yes. Analysts suggest that the moralistic hurdle for North Korea to use nuclear weapons may be perceived by Pyongyang as lower against Japan, a historic adversary, than against fellow Koreans in the South. This nuclear blackmail would aim to pressure the Japanese government and public opinion to deny the U.S. access to those indispensable bases, effectively hamstringing the U.S. intervention without North Korea having to engage in a conventional war itself.
That makes Japan's role truly existential in this structure, going beyond just the Taiwan scenario. Japan is, as you said, the foundation of the U.S.'s Pax Americana policy in the region.
That is the ultimate strategic context. The Pentagon views Japan as one of the two most important strategic footholds globally, along with the UK managing the left half of the globe, covering Asia and the Middle East. For the U.S. bases like Yokota Air Base, which houses the headquarters of U.S. Forces Japan, and the JASDF Air Defense Command, and the critical Kadena, are indispensable to this grand conception of world management. If these bases cannot survive the initial shock of a conventional or nuclear missile barrage, the entire premise of U.S. regional power projection and global management is threatened.
But this immense strategic imperative runs headlong into a significant and complex domestic political dilemma within Japan itself, especially regarding public support for military involvement.
Absolutely. The government knows the strategic necessity, but the public is hesitant about entanglement. While nearly 80% of the Japanese public expresses concern about a Taiwan crisis, support for deploying Japan's self-defense forces, the SDF, to actually fight alongside the U.S. forces is only 22%.
Only 22%.
Right. A larger portion, 47%, supports allowing the U.S. to use Japanese bases for staging operations, but an equal 47% oppose military involvement entirely.
So it's split right down the middle.
Exactly. And this highlights a critical political risk, the potential for entrapment anxiety among the Japanese public. China could exploit this through cognitive warfare, propaganda, or overt threats, pressuring the government to deny the U.S. access at the very moment it needs those bases the most. The survivability of the bases is a political question just as much as it is a military one.
Faced with this clear, quantitative assessment of base vulnerability, the looming two-front crisis, and these complex alliance hurdles, both Japan and the U.S. have started taking concrete strategic steps. How is Japan responding to this existential threat identified in the war game?
Japan has made a significant shift in its defense policy. Its new national security strategy and national defense strategy are a direct formal response. They explicitly identify China as the unprecedented and greatest strategic challenge. Japan is focusing on enhancing two complementary defense capabilities at the same time. First, deterrence by denial, which means missile defense and homeland resilience, the ability to absorb a shock and keep fighting. And second, deterrence by punishment, which they call long-range strike or counterstrike capability.
Counterstrike, that represents a major political and military shift for Japan, moving away from a strictly defensive posture. What does that specifically involve in terms of hardware?
It involves the introduction of powerful long-range weapons like the U.S.-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which can strike mainland targets, and the parallel deployment of Japan's own advanced indigenous missile systems.
So they're building an offensive capability.
An offensive capability aimed at deterrence. The effort is aimed at ensuring that if China attacks U.S. or Japanese forward bases, Japan can coordinate with the U.S. to retaliate and significantly increase the opportunity cost and risk for China's aggression. This coordinated offensive capability within the alliance is seen as crucial for restoring regional response capacity and maintaining deterrence through capability parity.
And the need for seamless cooperation in the face of this immediate threat led directly to the institutionalization of the trilateral alliance, which had previously been hampered by historical disputes between South Korea and Japan.
That institutionalization, which was finalized at the August 2023 Camp David summit between the U.S., Japan, and ROK, was vital. The summit aimed to make security cooperation sustainable and less vulnerable to political volatility or leadership changes. They agreed on three key documents: the Camp David principles, the spirit of Camp David, and the commitment to consult.
And what was the key practical outcome of that?
The key practical outcome was the implementation of multi-year trilateral exercise plans, enhanced information sharing, and critically, the commitment to real-time missile warning data exchange.
The real-time data exchange must be massive for missile defense.
It is a game changer. It means that the instant North Korea or China launches a missile, all three nations receive the tracking data simultaneously. This dramatically shortens the decision cycle for missile defense systems and provides maximum warning time against threats aimed at the U.S. homeland, South Korea, or the U.S. forward bases in Japan. It makes the alliance functionally faster and more resilient.
Okay, so institutionalizing the alliance is necessary, but it still doesn't fix the structural problem we identified, the sheer vulnerability of the airfields themselves. The analysis from the Hudson Institute provides 3 detailed lines of effort for the U.S. and its allies to address this strategic asymmetry directly. What's the first recommendation for leveling the playing field?
The first effort is a strategy of competitive spending. Induce continued PRC defensive investments. The sources argue that the U.S. should focus on improving its ability to strike deeply and en masse, specifically targeting China's high-value forces like aircraft.
Why the aircraft specifically?
It's strategic jujitsu. The goal is to force the PLA to continuously spend massive amounts of capital on costly passive and active defenses to protect its assets. Every dollar China spends on concrete for defense, on new HES, on dispersal, on missile defense, is a dollar it cannot spend on offensive power projection capabilities like more ships or strike missiles. It's a way of forcing China to make tough economic trade-offs in their budget.
The second effort is the most relevant to our discussion, actually fixing the infrastructure crisis now.
This is the urgent call. Build resilient infrastructure. The solution cannot be individual, modest projects. It must become a comprehensive national security campaign of construction. Resilience requires a combination of passive defenses, hardening, dispersal, redundancy, reconstitution capabilities, and active defenses.
So let's revisit the passive defense necessity, specifically the hardened aircraft shelters. The analysis argues we must require HAS for high-value assets like the B-21 bomber, even if it means painful procurement trade-offs in the short term.
The sources are blunt that these trade-offs are essential to absorb the shock of an initial strike and preserve our striking power. To illustrate the scale, analysts calculated that procuring one fewer B-21 bomber per year for 5 years could fund 100 hardened aircraft shelters in the continental U.S.
100 shelters for 5 planes.
This trade-off sacrifices a sliver of offensive capacity in the future to ensure the survival of the extremely expensive assets we already have today. Without that baseline of infrastructure resilience, all future offensive capabilities are suppressed in a conflict's opening hours.
And what about the necessary active defense requirements to protect those bases?
That requires the U.S. Army to step up its commitment to ground-based air defense, a commitment that seriously lapsed after the Cold War. The recommendation is to reallocate funding within the Army from maneuver forces to significantly grow the Air Defense Artillery, or ADA, branch.
So more missile defense units.
Yes. The Army needs to deepen its capacity to defend airfields, ports, and critical logistical assets with lethal, adaptable, and resilient active defense designs. And this means moving beyond just the expensive Patriot missiles and investing in a mix of systems, including cheaper options like medium-caliber cannons and high-powered microwaves, which are better suited to handling the massive volume of incoming drones and cruise missiles expected in a saturation attack.
Finally, the third line of effort deals with long-term force design, looking past the immediate need for concrete.
That's evolve the force. This is the long-term fix, accelerating the fielding of forces that are inherently less susceptible to airfield attack. This includes long-range, long-endurance aircraft like the B-21 and the next-generation tankers, which can operate from more distant, safer airfields.
Or things that don't need runways at all.
Or, increasingly, runway-independent forces like advanced missiles and autonomous platforms. However, the analysis issues a stark warning. These new survivable systems won't be fielded in large numbers until the 2030s. They absolutely do not negate the immediate critical need for hardening today. The Department of Defense cannot wait for future technology to solve its current existential airfield weaknesses.
This deep dive leaves us with a stark and uncomfortable picture. The CSIS war game suggests that a tactical victory for the U.S. and its allies is possible, but it comes at a catastrophic cost in material and lives, and only if four complex, politically fraught premises are met. The ultimate vulnerability exposed is the massive, destabilizing asymmetry in airfield hardening. China's systematic construction campaign risks incentivizing them to exercise a first-mover advantage against exposed U.S. and allied infrastructure, knowing that a few dozen of their missiles could neutralize hundreds of our high-value jets.
And we have to hold on to the deeper context here. Japan is not just an ally, it is one of the two strategic pillars globally, a foundational foothold for the U.S. policy of Pax Americana, tasked with managing crises across Asia and the Middle East. The risk of attack on those forward bases, Kadena, Yokosuka, Yokota, it threatens not just our ability to defend Taiwan, but the entire concept of sustained U.S. global influence. If those critical nodes cannot survive the opening salvo of a major power conflict, the entire structure of regional and global stability is compromised.
That brings us back to the crucial question of resources and prioritization right now. We've seen the calculated value of hardening a $4 million shelter, protecting an $80 million asset, compared to the cost of replacing that asset. So budget trades are necessary to close this immediate resilience gap, meaning fewer new aircraft in the short term, but more hardened shelters for the jets we already have, is preventing the PLA from destroying $80 million fighter jets on the ground, worth delaying the purchase of just one $600 million B-21 bomber.
That is the essential, difficult choice facing defense planners right now. We have definitively left the era where forward bases enjoy sanctuary. Deterrence now depends entirely on demonstrating not just offensive power, but the resilience to survive and sustain operations after taking a powerful, immediate punch.
It's a fundamental shift in strategic thinking that demands immediate action and an investment in concrete, not just cutting-edge technology. We encourage you to review your own understanding of how strategic deterrence works when there is no longer sanctuary for your most critical assets.